She has led all aspects of the Bangko Sentral's financial inclusion work over the last 2 decades. In 2020, she took a leave to work as director for Her Majesty Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, the UN Secretary General's special advocate for inclusive finance for development. Since her return to the Bangko Sentral, sustainability has become a key focus. With us now for Thought Leaders, please welcome Assistant Governor and the Governor's Chief of Staff, Pia Roman-Tatar. Good to have you with us, Pia. Thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations, a double congratulations at that.
Thank you for having me. An honor to be on your show, Cathy.
So you've got 2 roles, and it's quite different from where you came from where we've come to know you. Spend most of your time at the Bangko Sentral, and you also came back from secondment.
Yes.
Where you learned more about that key word right now, that buzzword called sustainability.
Yes. Well, indeed, I came back in July of last year. So it's been 1 year, almost a year back in the BSP after spending almost 3 years at the UN in New York, learning how important financial inclusion is in the context of COVID, the pandemic that really gave rise to the need for resilience in households, individuals, and firms, and looking at sustainability and what we need to do moving forward.
What was it like working with the Queen Maxima? I mean, you first met her when she was still a princess.
I did.
She came here in 2015.
Yes.
And now you engaged in a sustainability initiative with her as Queen.
Yes. Well, you know, when you're working with her, you almost forget she's a queen because she's just like any demanding boss who, you know, wants to do good work. But it was an amazing experience. Definitely expanded my perspectives and my way of thinking. As a tireless advocate, her role was to put issues on the global agenda, and so organizing side events at the G20 Leaders Summit or talking to global CEOs and making them care about financial inclusion and why it's important to growth and development. And so just the way she works and she relates to these leaders, but also the way she prepares. So it was new, but also a lot of things we knew already, you know, just a lot of understanding the issues, getting the data, you know, to strengthen the advocacy messages.
And rightfully so, because she was a banker. So you got that baseline there. You were talking along that same language.
And she knew what central bank governors need to hear. She knew what bankers need to hear. So really how to align their own objectives to the advocacy that she was pushing. So.
And she knew what you were bringing to the table because we were number 1 in microfinance. I mean, that's where we kind of hit the map, didn't we?
Yes.
When it comes to inclusion at its early stage. And you were in that whole journey from 2010.
Yes.
Up to the pandemic and beyond.
Earlier, actually, Cathy, because so I joined the central bank in 2002. And I was employee number 1 of a microfinance unit. And the idea was to mainstream microfinance in the banking sector because there was a wealth of knowledge of how this new technology of lending to what previously were unbanked or unbankable could be a viable business. And it was win-win because they were good, you know, their repayments were 99% to 100, and it just made sense. And so for us, for the Philippines, it was really an imperative to make the financial system more inclusive, coupled with just the leadership's commitment in seeing, you know, we were all in the central bank as regulator and supervisor working on a strong and stable banking system. And then former Governor Espinilla would say, what use is it if it doesn't cater to the majority of the Filipinos? And so I think the imperative and the commitment really pushed the BSP to be a leader in microfinance in those early days. But that was put to the
test when COVID hit.
Yes.
Financial inclusion.
Yes.
There were the cracks that we've seen.
Yes.
But we were already a leader in financial inclusion. I mean, the Economist Group's Economist Intelligence Unit already ranked the Philippines as top 4
yes.
in the list of countries promoting financial inclusion.
Yes.
But what happened in the pandemic?
Well, during the pandemic, we were first because we put in the regulatory framework, and I would say we put in the rails. It took a little longer to get people actually in the financial system. So in 2011, when globally we were starting to collect financial inclusion data, only 26% of adults in the Philippines were in the formal financial system. When the pandemic hit, it didn't increase all that much. But, well, before the pandemic, it didn't increase all that much. But we did have the rails. When the pandemic hit, that's when we saw a massive increase. So the latest figure would be about 56%. So we included about 30 million people since we started measuring this into the formal financial system. And that's where digital played a very big role.
Thanks to technology.
Thanks to
when
technology.
When we started to talk about digital wallets.
Exactly.
This is
exactly. So we were, again, one of the pioneers in issuing the electronic money circular way back years before the pandemic hit. But the traction really happened during the pandemic when people saw the need for it. And once they experienced it, saw the convenience, and that started it. I think we'll see, the trajectory is just amazing in terms of take-up.
So compared to other jurisdictions, other geographies, how do we do? I mean, we had the rails early on, and we had digital transformation going on at a time of COVID.
Yes.
Did we do good?
We did very well. I think we were prepared. Policymakers were very decisive also at that point, shifting a lot of payments to digital, social transfers to digital. But I think there's still a long way to go. Having an account is just one thing, and really being able to maximize access to financial services, to build resilience, to seize economic opportunities, that's where we want to go. And I think there we still have some ways to go.
Because I'm thinking about those who qualify for 4Ps.
Yes.
Who did not get the money that they were supposed to get.
Yes, yes.
And this is a huge number in the population.
Yeah.
That we still have to address, that
Exactly.
the Bangko Sentral is focusing on.
Yes, no, for sure. And we were one of the advocates for making sure the 4Ps could get their payments through an account, because we see the account as a gateway to financial inclusion. So once they have an account with the technology now, if they make payments, if they withdraw, if they keep a little savings, that's already information, that's already data. And maybe a financial service provider can issue a small loan, or maybe cover for insurance, or access other financial services. So getting more people in the financial system, and then making sure that they have access to a broader range of financial services.
So does that mean recalibrating the strategy that we started with back in 2011?
Yes.
Is that the 6-year
Exactly.
plan that you got started, the Bangko Sentral got started in 2022?
Yes, so in 2022, I was not here. So of course, it's all my colleagues at the BSP who are manning this agenda within the BSP. Refresh the plan to really look at, inclusion is not the end. It's not the end in itself, but it should be inclusion for what? And there they focus on building financial health and building resilience and having access to financial services for SMEs, for key sectors like SMEs and agriculture sectors. So that was the refresh, and it was very timely because we reached that point where we did expand access to financial services, and the question is, okay, what next? So that's where we are right now. And when I came in with Governor Eli Remolona came in with a fresh mandate as governor, and looking at his priorities, one of the things he said is we want our sustainability agenda to be inherently inclusive. And so this is what we are now trying to work on in the BSP.
So that's a key word now under the new governor, and it's something that you're now managing as chief of staff. So it's a total change from where you're coming from.
Yes, I'm learning. I'm definitely not an expert in this space, but I think, with the learnings that I've taken from all the 20 years in BSP and also my short experience at the UN, where sustainability was always in the global discussions, trying to see what we can do. And the Philippines is unique because a lot of the sustainability efforts are focused on mitigation, which is important. Of course, the Philippines has its own commitments. But our climate strategy as a country is really focused on adaptation with mitigation as a co-benefit. So how do we channel funding in adaptation where 91% of funding goes to mitigation globally, and similarly here as well. So I think that is the part that is innovative and new in terms of thinking, and that's what we need to crack. And I think that's what will make the difference too with those who are most affected by climate events. And it's really the poorest and the most vulnerable, and they have the least tools to manage these risks.
Why it's important
Yes.
to consider climate change,
Yes.
sustainability,
Yes.
when we talk about maybe an individual with savings in a bank, or maybe an entrepreneur with an existing loan.
Yeah.
How do we make sense of it? Why should I care?
Yes.
That's a number one question that probably regulators will have to answer and make people interested and get them to join you in that crusade, in that campaign
Yes.
towards climate change and sustainability.
I think more and more this will become an easier task because we see the effects so clearly and so tangibly. I mean, it can be as subtle as increased, the past few weeks have been extremely hot. I mean, my kids
It
had
has.
to not have classes because of these extreme weather events, and that makes it very tangible, and it affects us on in our day to day. But then it affects, there's lower productivity of labor, of capital, of assets, and so there's impact at every stage. So I think it becomes clearer, and then we see the big events, the super typhoons, for example. Like, of course, we remember Yolanda. That cost us about, the estimates there, 4% of GDP for that year in 2013. So there are these subtle, but there's also these stark events that really put it top of mind. And communicating that to an entrepreneur who knows that, the supply chain in which maybe their business fits could be disrupted because of climate events or nature-related events. Knowing that, and then on the part of the banks, the risks that to their portfolios in terms of who they are supporting. So there's key messages, I think, for every stakeholder, and we have some work to do to make sure that resonates, and so that we can all collectively work towards this objective.
What about for an individual with just a simple savings account? How does it make sense for them to pick and choose maybe the right bank, the right financing institution, to make sure that what is being invested is towards adaptation, as you mentioned, rather than mitigation?
Yes. Well, I think now there's more information that customers have, and they can choose, what really suits them. It's about suitability. What are their objectives to get that financial services? If it's a savings for a rainy day, then they can pick what product is good for them. If it's insurance, then they know what they're insuring against. I think key here is, you have to have access to financial services that will help you with your worries or with the risks you think you will be facing, or help you meet the opportunities you want to seize. So in choosing, then you can have those considerations. In terms of making sure that your money is, being invested in sustainability, we will be seeing more and more of that. Already we have disclosure requirements. The SEC has disclosure requirements for listed companies. The central bank has also issued a series of regulations that puts certain expectations on our banks on environmental and social risk management. So I think more and more customers could be made aware, of the standing of the financial institutions they choose. And I think this is unique of the millennials and the Gen Zs, and what is it now? But the younger generation, they're more I guess aware, and more socially and environmentally aware, that they demand that the companies that they patronize are also practicing sustainable practices. So I think that this is a confluence of positive developments that will help us get to where we want to be.
I was just going to get to that, the demographic, because it appears that what this is really harnessing is geared towards the generations who would demand it.
Yeah.
But how does that filter through or flow through to the more senior ones? Maybe the moms, their dads, granddads. What's the plan there?
I would say there will be a positive effect if the children are doing it, and I say this because this is in literature and financial literacy. They said that if the children practice good financial habits, they positively influence their parents. And this was actually there was a study. So
it's the other way around.
That's the other way around. And so I'm quite optimistic that similarly, as children are made more aware and are more demanding of the companies they patronize, it will have a good effect, positive effect to the parents as well.
To your point in financial literacy, as there is a close link to inflation, and as we're seeing a bit of reacceleration on inflation, how would you gauge our level of financial literacy and the way it impacts the power of the consumer for purchasing goods?
Unfortunately, our levels of financial literacy are still low.
Why is that?
And this is measured, there are global measures for this, understanding basic time value of money, which will help you make decisions whether to save or, where to put your money. It's still very low. And I think, the Bangko Sentral has been working tirelessly in this front. The most impactful has been seen to start young. And so we have worked with the Department of Education to actually incorporate financial literacy in the curriculum, not as a standalone, but incorporated in the different subjects. So really starting them young. The next phase is making it real. So people who are actually accessing financial services, to make sure that they have the right tips to nudge them to make the right decision. So here we have partnerships with financial institutions, with associations, to make sure we have that message of prudently managing your finances. That will affect on how people view the economy, on what decisions they will make, on investments, or whether to take out a loan, and to really make the right informed financial decisions.
So it'll take a generation still before we get to a point where we can say our youth are financially literate.
I hope not. I hope
we can hasten that process.
I think technology is, technology has revolutionized a lot of things that typically take longer. There's also a lot of studies on how to nudge financial behavior. So maybe that will accelerate the process. And more people are looking to digital tools to get information, to transact, and to communicate. And so hopefully that will accelerate. So I'm a little optimistic, but we will keep at it, and hopefully.
If your kids were the gauge, would you be as optimistic?
Yes. Yes. my kids so far they plan, they save for what they want, and they regularly go to banks and deposit their money. So
well, that's very admirable. They probably made a mention of the word greenwash.
Oh yes.
Greenwash, which is a concern here. It's misleading or deceptive publicity over what really is sustainable financing, or at least a climate-inclined project. There is a concern among climate activists who say that the government's climate spending is nothing more than an attempt to greenwash. Is that a concern here? That the massive spending that's going into our climate-initiated activities are going to poorly allocated projects, as well as remain inadequately accounted for.
Yes.
So there is a problem with accountability and transparency in this case.
That's an issue globally, and we're trying to do our best to address that, and that is the reason why we're looking at disclosure rules, As I mentioned to you, we issued our environmental and social risk management, which is our expectation of our supervised entities. On this, the taxonomy. So we issued together with, so the BSP together with the Insurance Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the PDIC, so this is the Financial Sector Forum, issued our first sustainable finance taxonomy guidelines. And, to make things more transparent, for banks or financial institutions to classify, their assets and their activities to make sure that we address these concerns. And I think that transparency will not only address the greenwashing issues, but will also incentivize greater flow of resources into the areas that we want, supporting the climate objectives that we have.
Talk to us about incentivizing. Might we have maybe best examples so far of how the Bangko Sentral, the taxonomy guidelines have incentivized companies to go to the projects that would be considered sustainable?
Yeah. I think our role here as central bank is one is to signal. I think, and by the issuances that we've had, the Sustainable Finance Roadmap in 2020, the ESRM Circular in 2021, is really signaling how we see this as important for the financial system to be sound and stable, but also to channel to productive, its potential to channel sustainable growth and development. So that's one. The second is to issue the guidelines and to incentivize, as you said. And in this space, we've had some recent issuances on providing incentives for sustainable and green lending, for example. We've also had, for example, gradual reduction of reserve requirements for sustainability bonds, increase in single borrowers limit for green financing. So there are these levers that we try to provide to incentivize this kind of activity. And of course, the taxonomy is again a guideline for banks to see how they can classify so that they can channel the resources. For now, it's a classification. We issued it in February. It's 1 year observation period is what we call it. For us to learn, for the banks to learn, we're getting questions, I have a loan to this, they have a transition plan, where do I put it? It's a traffic lighting system at the moment, green, amber, red. And eventually, with the learnings we get from this 1 year, we can then see, do we incentivize a little bit of this, or are there rules that we need to put in place for these types of loans? So this will be a journey, but we see that as a way, and it has happened in other jurisdictions, as a way to really channel resources to these activities.
So what's the grid looking like in terms of color? Is it mostly red or turning
None
green?
yet. We don't have it yet because we issued it in February.
Okay.
Banks are just starting to look at these guidelines.
But ever since COP28 in Dubai, my understanding is the Bangko Sentral relaxed rules to allow for more lending for green projects.
Yes.
So my
Yes.
question is, what's been the take-up
Yes.
so far? Has it been well received, or are you still needing to invite them to come in?
No, very well received. We don't have yet the clear, because we're also learning in this process and also starting to measure. But then we can say that about 75% of our commercial banks, universal and commercial banks, are doing sustainable or green lending already. And this, I think, from in the 2022 figures that we saw, it's a little dated, but it was already about $14 billion in sustainable and green lending. We have about 8 banks that have issued sustainability bonds, sustainable and social bonds. So there's definitely take up there. I think that's about $1.5 billion. So the energy is there, the interest is there. We also do an annual survey of banks and bank loan officers, and increasingly there is interest from just last year of 60%, 2022 of 61%, now 70% of these loan officers are saying that sustainability exposure will be very significant for
Where
them.
do we draw the line? I mean, that's a huge jump. I mean, not even comparing with maybe foreign counterparts. Where does just transition go into that percentage jump? It would appear that maybe some of the approved projects might not really be ready. Like, let's say
Yes.
the energy
No,
industry,
for sure.
instance.
For sure. And that is why we really emphasize, and the governor has emphasized, that the sustainability agenda needs to be inherently inclusive. And this is mindful exactly of what you said. I mean, we can't just say, no, we will transition and not be mindful of the communities that will be displaced, or the electricity that will be too expensive or too prohibitive for those who cannot afford them. And so this is, I think this is the strategy that we hope to develop. This is part of the governor's corporate strategy out of his 5 priorities in the next 6 years, in the next 5 years. And so we will work on that for sure and
Is there
make
a
that line
neighbor
very clear.
in Southeast Asia we can look towards in terms of sustainable financing?
Yeah, so we are part of a network called the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network. And they're looking at this increasingly because the perspective of the emerging economies are very different from the developed economies when you're talking climate. And I think this network is really trying to, get the good practice out there. And in fact, just in January, I co-chair this working group within that network called Inclusive Sustainability. And that's precisely what we're trying to figure out and trying to come up with good practice, where to draw the line, how to draw it, so it's clear for everyone, market players, financial institutions.
So they're still trying to figure things out. We're not behind.
We're not behind. We're all trying to figure
Maybe
things
they're
out.
looking towards us because in terms of policy, we
Yes.
know what not to do, at least for the Bangko Sentral, the Agri-Agra law.
Yes.
Maybe you can give us a bit of a
Yeah.
background there
Yes.
and why we shouldn't go there.
Yeah, so the Agri-Agra law, I mean, it's very well intentioned to really channel resources to our agriculture sector, which is, of course, very significant for our economy. But it was a law that mandated lending to that sector. As a supervisor, of course, of the banks, we want to make sure that their credit exposures, that their assessment of the credit exposures take into consideration the viability of the projects that they lend to. The difficulty in mandating that credit is that balance because, in a way you're telling them to lend to sectors, and sometimes some banks, especially the bigger banks, may not have that intimacy with the agriculture sector, with the smallholder farmers, to adequately assess their credit risk. And so that's where the difficulty or the challenge was. And with the recent amendment to the Agri-Agra law, the legislators have expanded the scope, recognizing that the agriculture sector does not exist in a vacuum, and it exists in a local economic development context, and looking also that sustainability is crucial to the agriculture sector. And so now even green or sustainable activities and other types of local economic activities could be used as compliance to this Agri-Agra. So the banks are happier because now there's more options for them to still support local economic development, but not be too constrained in the counterparts that they need to choose. And it's also helped a lot in the sustainability because now it's also part of the compliance mechanism. So it was a learning for sure, and with this new amendment, we are seeing the results already, the very positive results from the banks.
And when we talk about banks, you mentioned banks, is that both for traditional as well as digital banks?
Yes.
Taking a stab at that ecosystem in agriculture?
Yes, so all the banks are required. I understand that there are some grace periods for newly established banks, of course, because, and that would be for all our 6 digital banks because they are relatively newly established, but then it will apply to all eventually.
Even energy? Are they ready for sustainable financing?
Yes, and I think transition is key here, in making sure that we have viable transition plans. We do have global commitments in terms of making sure at least, I think, 35% is renewable. Last year, in 2022, this was already at 21%. So I think we're doing well there. But again, making sure that it is not at the expense of those that are most vulnerable to climate events. So that line that you said is very important, and that's really what we hope to do, and we need to build capacity here. I think the data is important, so that is one big agenda. We don't really have the data yet in terms of, how are these communities adapting? what will the climate scenarios look like for those that are most vulnerable. And I think with that, we can really engage in more evidence-based policy making moving forward.
If we fail to ramp up on adaptation, what would be the worst case scenario that would impact the economy?
I don't want to talk about it. It's just very devastating. It's very devastating for all. The World Bank has estimated that if we do nothing, by 2030, I think the damages, the economic damages, will be about 7.6% of GDP. So the economic costs will be huge. But I cannot emphasize enough the economic cost to those that are already, the vulnerable and the low income. 3 out of 4 people in poverty rely on natural resources to survive. And so the climate impacts go directly to our natural resources. Our smallholder farmers make up a lot of those in poverty, and they will be most affected also by climate events. So I think that part, I think, is why we need to really ramp up our efforts on this.
And that's gone on for at least 2 decades at the time that you've already spent at the Bangko Sentral 22 years with, correct me if I'm wrong, 5th boss.
Yes,
Governor
Governor Buenaventura, Governor Tatanco, Governor Espinilla, Governor Medalla, Governor Jokno, and 6.
I covered
and
them all
Governor
as a journalist.
Yes, all 6 governors.
How would you characterize the gentlemen who have helmed up the Bangko Sentral when it was still Central Bank and when it was Bangko Sentral? And how did that shape the way you're speaking about sustainability today?
Yes, so maybe the ones who I've directly worked with, and start with Governor Tatanco. Governor Tatanco was really, for me, maybe in one word, stability. And also just making sure you do your work and be very assiduous in your work. And I think that is how I would characterize him. Governor Espinilla, who I worked with most among the governors, is really the innovator and the disruptor. He didn't take the status quo if things could be better. Governor Diokno, I think it was very decisive. That's how I would describe him, and that was so crucial during the pandemic and making those decisions. Unfortunately, I was in the U.S. when Governor Medalla was governor, but he was always very enriching in all the interactions we had. So now Governor Remolona is my direct boss as his chief of staff. And he is really the central banker of the central banker of central bankers, having had that global experience at the Federal Reserve, at the BIS. But he is inherently a teacher. And here we are learning from him really the fundamentals of what needs to be in place. So I think all of that have contributed to why we see the issues we have at the moment and trying to look pragmatically at what we can do, but also pushing the needle at what really needs to be done. So that's on my own personal take of how I've learned from all these wonderful leaders of the central bank, but also the many colleagues that I've worked with at the BSP. But it's the start of a journey. I think this looking at sustainability with an inclusion lens is new. But it's important and it's an imperative.
One would think that there's just gentlemen at the central bank, but that's not true.
Not true.
There's a lot of women, and there's statistics to base that. The Rise magazine.
Oh, yes.
Yes, it states that women dominate over 60% of BSP bank supervisors.
Yes.
More than a third of BSP's data, statistics, and research complement. And almost 80% of staff in payments and settlements. That's a lot of women.
No, I know when they shared those figures with me, I was quite surprised. I knew that there was a good balance in the BSP, and even in senior leadership, we have 2 deputy governors who are women, and then the three deputy governors who are men. But I was surprised at those figures as well. And then
You don't see them in the corridors when you're walking at the Bangko Sentral?
there's a very good balance. I think it also has to do with college graduates. I was told that the ratio is really still more women than men. I think it's 1.32 to 1 women graduates to men. So maybe it's a factor of that, but I think increasingly central banking job, finance, I think increasingly we are seeing more women, which studies have shown is a good thing. Diversity in general is a good thing, and so I'm happy to be in that workplace.
The quality of discussions, say during COVID and post-COVID, discussions on gender issues, have you seen the needle move perhaps? Have they become more qualitative, more in favor of inclusion in terms of gender at the Bangko Sentral?
I think so. And I'll make this comment from my perspective at the UN, where this is always high on the agenda. And I was there during the pandemic, and so even more so. And I really saw the importance of recognizing the diversity and the different needs of the different groups and making sure the workplace responds to that. And I'm hopefully bringing a little bit of that back to the BSP, because I think the productivity will increase, the engagement, the employee engagement with the institution will increase if they feel that the workplace does respect that diversity and puts a premium on it and really tries to understand the varying needs. And if all those voices are heard and they do feel engaged, we've seen really positive impact. So I think we hope to see more of that.
So we've got the structure in, but we just need voices. We just need them to rise up and speak out.
Yes.
How do you encourage a culture like that at the Bangko Sentral?
I think right now everyone is empowered to speak at the Bangko Sentral. I mean, in meetings, maybe to institutionalize it. So we do have a gender and development program in the BSP, and we try to make sure that our mechanisms empower everyone to speak up.
Is there a link already to relating gender inclusivity with climate financing, or is that a little bit down along the lines of sustainability?
I think inclusivity in general, because sustainability cuts across, environmental is just one piece. There's social, there's economic, there's governance, and inclusion is important in all those to be viable and sustainable. So I think there is definitely a link for inclusion in general, gender inclusion in particular. A lot of people who say, in the Philippines, it's not so much an issue. Because we've had female presidents, you see CEOs that are presidents. Even in financing, more women have access to accounts than men in the Philippines. And that's a reverse gender gap than it is globally, because globally, there's more men than women who have access to accounts. But if you look at the data more granularly, for example, for financial services, more men have access to certain financial accounts than men, like investments, for example, or using digital. So we can't take things at face value. We have to understand if this is really the case and understand the underlying issues to be really faithfully and meaningfully address the inclusion issue.
What do you think it's going to take to have a woman as Bangko Sentral governor?
I think a lot of our central bank colleagues are ready to be central bank governor. I think we'll see when that will happen.
Well, before you go, we have a couple of questions here from my own team. They're quite interested in financing, personal financing. And tatagalugin ko na.
Okay.
Ano ang masasabi mo doon sa mga hindi na nabayaran ng inutangan? Ano ang dapat nilang gawin?
Hindi nabayaran ng inutangan. Okay, ang pag-uutang kasi ay agreement siya, no? Parang pag sa bangko meron kang kontrata, so kailangan bayaran. Ang problema ay minsan nagpapautang tayo sa pamilya o sa kaibigan. So dyan medyo mahirap, no? So I think pinakamabuting magagawa natin ay kausapin. Kasi it's a personal relationship and the personal arrangement. But I think kahit informal, put it in writing, right? Because then there's still that commitment. I think in general, Filipinos, even when, I was looking on very much in the ground in microfinance, for example, they want to pay. And there's an intent to pay. But I think formalizing it and making sure, I think will help. But that's a reality. A lot of even the data will show that family and friends is the largest source of loans by, by Filipinos. So we need to make sure that, we put these things in writing and the expectations are clear.
And hardest to collect from. Susunod na tanong, anong suggestion mo doon sa mga hindi nakakabayad ng utang?
Okay. And informal or formal sources, I think keep the communication open, whether it's formal or informal. And, explain why you're not able to pay and maybe work out an arrangement to make it easier to repay your loan. Again, on the premise that you really want to, if circumstances are not allowing you to, show good faith in how you can work it out. And I think that's, you can translate that even in formal settings.
Can you be financially free kahit minimum wage earner ka?
Yes, because, there are studies that financial health is not a figure of the level of income. It largely is, but it is not the only determinant. So making ends meet is a very difficult task. Managing finances, I think you're able to save a little bit. So I think proper financial management is key so that you can be financially free and financially healthy.
Now, as a central banker mom with 3 kids,
yes, 3
how
kids.
are you budgeting the needs of a family? As a central banker mom,
Always have a plan. Always have a
Always?
financial plan. And
Nakalista ba yun?
Nakalista,
Pascal
a budget.
Savet?
Yes,
Okay.
and really keeping a budget, knowing what comes in, what goes out, and planning for the future. I think the components of financial health are being able to manage day to day, being able to plan for the future and invest in your future. And so having a plan, I think, is a first step. We stray sometimes, but always going back to the plan.
And one doesn't need to be a central banker to have a plan.
Yes, I think everyone should have a plan. And yeah, everyone should have a plan and manage their finance. Try to manage their finances.
As a final question, any advice you give to the youth, the millennials out there listening to you now, on blazing a trail, entering central banking, and making a change as big as sustainability?
Yes. Well, I think in terms of entering central banking, we do have a lot of programs. We have a Junior Central Bank Associates program now that we just, opened to fresh graduates. We have a Central Bank Associates program. So there is a career in central banking where you can contribute to nation building through central banking. But as citizens, as youth, keep vigilant, keep trying to expand your horizons and trying to see where you could make the most difference. I think I'm very optimistic with the next generation. As I told you, they're more aware, they're more demanding of the services and providers that they patronize. So I think that's a step in the right direction. We hope on the side of the corporates, on the side of the companies, they become more accountable. And I think with this, we can achieve such a big goal as inclusive sustainability.
We can't go it alone. We need the help of everyone, as
Definitely.
you mentioned, the whole
Definitely.
of nation approach,
The whole of-
especially as it's sustainability.
Exactly. Across government, the private sector, but everyone as well.
Well, I thank you for this opportunity. All the best
Thank
in your
you,
sustainability
Cathy.
plans,
Thank
Pia.
you very much for
Much
having me.
appreciate your time. Catch us again next Thursday at 9 p.m. Philippine Standard Time on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I'm Cathy Yang. This is Thought Leaders.